All right, so let's dive into something pretty crucial today, making sure that people who actually feed the world can keep doing it, even with climate change kind of, messing things up. Talking about small farms, local producers, the backbone of food security for billions. It's a dense report, making finance flow to adaptation in small-scale agri-food systems. But we're going to break down the most important bits for you.
Yeah, you got it. This report is basically like a roadmap for how to achieve what they call climate resilient development. And it all kind of centers around something called Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement.
Okay, so the Paris Agreement, I vaguely remember that from like high school. Remind me what that is again.
You know, the big global agreement to tackle climate change. Well, Article 2.1c is a specific part of it that's all about aligning financial systems with climate goals. This report argues it's not just for reducing emissions, but also for helping these small-scale food systems adapt to the impacts that are already happening.
Because it's like we're not just trying to prevent the problem, we're also trying to help people cope with the mess that's already here.
Exactly. And the report makes it clear that there's a huge disconnect between where climate finance is going and where it's needed most.
Okay, let's get specific. Just how bad are things for these small-scale farmers and producers?
Well, think about it. They're already dealing with unpredictable weather, shifting seasons, pests, and diseases. They're on the front lines, and they often have the least resources to cope.
And yet they're feeding a huge chunk of the world.
It is a bit mind-boggling when you consider that in 2019 and 2020, these systems received a measly 0.8% of the total climate finance flowing globally. And it's been going down since then.
Hold on, less than 1%. That's a tiny crumb of the pie. So how is this Article 2.1c supposed to turn things around? We're not just talking about charity handouts, are we?
Not at all. The report focuses on practical strategies governments can use. They call them consistency makers, which basically means using policies and regulations to kind of nudge financial systems in the right direction. Think of it like setting up the rules of the game so that investing in climate resilience actually makes financial sense.
Give me an example. How do these consistency makers play out in the real world?
One great example is Peru's crop insurance program.
Yeah.
They realized that a lot of small farmers couldn't afford insurance to protect themselves from climate-related losses. So they introduced targeted subsidies to make it more accessible.
So they're essentially taking some of the risk away, making it easier for farmers to invest in climate-smart practices. That's actually pretty clever.
Yeah, and it's been really effective in increasing the number of farmers who have that safety net. But it's not just about insurance. The report highlights a bunch of different consistency makers that are working in different contexts.
Okay, hit me with another one.
All right, how about green bonds? They've become a popular way to raise capital for climate-friendly projects. And Mexico's development bank is using them specifically to finance small climate-resilient farms.
Okay, hold up, I gotta back up a sec. Green bonds. For someone who barely understands regular bonds, break that down for me.
Sure, think of it like this. A bond is basically a loan that an investor makes to a government or a company. A green bond is the same thing, except the money is earmarked for projects that have environmental benefits. In this case, Mexico's development bank is using these green bonds to funnel investments directly to those small farms that are trying to operate in a more climate-resilient way.
So instead of just funding big infrastructure projects, they're actually targeting those smaller, often overlooked farms.
Exactly. And it's not just governments that can be consistency makers. The report also points to Colombia, where they've developed something called a green taxonomy.
A taxonomy? Is that like a fancy list of plants? I'm lost already.
Not quite. In this case, a green taxonomy is essentially a classification system that defines what counts as green investment. Colombia's taxonomy specifically includes small-scale farms that are adopting climate-resilient practices. This makes it crystal clear for investors who are looking to put their money into sustainable agriculture. And it's already attracting more capital to those farms.
So it's like a seal and approval that says, hey, investing in these farms is good for the planet and your portfolio.
I love how these concrete examples make it so much more tangible.
It's not just theoretical, it's actually happening on the ground. And here's another cool example. In Nepal, farmers have actually created their own labeling system to highlight their climate-resilient practices and connect directly with consumers.
Wait, so they're like cutting out the middleman and taking control of their own narrative?
Exactly. They're saying we're the ones adapting, we're the ones innovating, and we want consumers to know about it.
That's amazing. It's like they're building a more resilient food system from the bottom up. But this all seems very local, right? What about the bigger picture, those global forces that are also impacting these small farms?
You're absolutely right. And that's where things get even more complex. We need to think about those big systems like international trade, sovereign debt. Those are also huge pieces of the puzzle.
Now, wait a minute, sovereign debt. How does that tie into feeding people?
It's all connected, and this is where it gets really interesting. Okay, so before we went down this rabbit hole of sovereign debt, we were talking about how small-scale farmers are getting the short end of the stick when it comes to climate finance. And you mentioned these consistency makers, like that clever crop insurance program in Peru, as potential game changers. But are these policies really enough to shift the needle, or are we just kind of tinkering around the edges?
It's a valid question.
Mhm.
These national policies are crucial, but you're right. We can't ignore those global systems trade debt that are often working against these farmers. The report actually highlights a mind-blowing fact. Unsustainable food systems are contributing to the debt crisis in many developing countries.
Wait, seriously, how does that even work?
It's a vicious cycle. Many of these countries are forced to import food and fertilizer, racking up huge debts. This leaves them with less money to invest in making their own food systems more resilient. So they become even more reliant on imports, and the debt keeps piling up.
So it's like they're trapped in a system that's setting them up to fail. That's bleak.
It is. But there are glimmers of hope. Remember those debt-for-nature swaps we touched on earlier? Those are starting to gain traction as a way to address both the debt crisis and the climate crisis at the same time.
Refresh my memory. How do those work again?
Basically, a portion of a country's debt is forgiven. But with a catch, they have to commit to investing that money in conservation or sustainable development projects. It's a way to provide debt relief while also incentivizing climate-smart practices.
Okay, I'm seeing how that could be a win-win. But how does this actually help those small-scale farmers we're talking about?
Imagine a debt-for-nature swap that funds a project to restore degraded farmland, or helps farmers access water-efficient irrigation systems. Suddenly, they're not just struggling to survive, they're actually able to invest in making their farms more productive and resilient in the face of climate change.
Okay, I'm starting to see the potential here. But these swaps, they seem pretty niche, right? Are they really happening at a scale that can make a difference?
It's true, they're not a silver bullet, but there's growing momentum. Seychelles, for example, recently secured a debt-for-nature swap that's going to fund marine conservation and climate adaptation projects. And Belize just did one that will free up millions of dollars to protect their incredible barrier reef. So there's real-world progress happening.
All right, that's encouraging. But what about those global development banks? They have a lot of power and influence, right? What role are they playing in all of this?
They're absolutely critical. We need them to step up and prioritize funding for climate-resilient development, particularly for those small-scale producers who are so often overlooked.
But are they actually doing that? Are they putting their money where their mouth is?
It's a mixed bag. Some banks are definitely starting to shift their priorities, but there's still a long way to go. The African Development Bank, for example, is setting up a new facility specifically focused on agricultural climate risk insurance.
Wait, that sounds familiar. Didn't we talk about crop insurance in Peru?
Exactly. It's a similar concept, but at a much larger scale. The goal is to provide insurance to millions of smallholder farmers across Africa who are incredibly vulnerable to climate impacts, but have very limited access to financial safety nets.
So they're essentially scaling up that consistency maker idea, but at a regional level. That's pretty impressive.
It is, but it's also important to make sure these initiatives are designed in a way that truly benefits those small-scale producers. We need to be careful about unintended consequences, like making sure farmers aren't burdened with tons of paperwork or complicated procedures just to access these programs.
That's a good point. It's not enough to just throw money at the problem. It has to be done in a way that's actually accessible and equitable. But even with these positive steps, it feels like these global institutions are still kind of top-down, right? What about giving more power to the farmers themselves?
You're hitting on a crucial point. That's something the report emphasizes: the need to move beyond those top-down solutions and empower those small-scale actors.
Like giving them a seat at the table when these big decisions are being made?
Exactly. And it goes beyond that. It's about recognizing the incredible knowledge and expertise that these farmers already possess. They're the ones on the front lines of climate change. And they often have innovative solutions that just need to be supported and scaled up.
So it's not just about handing them a handout. It's about tapping into their wisdom and experience.
Precisely. We need to shift power dynamics and create a more level playing field where those who are most impacted by these challenges have a real voice in shaping the solutions.
I'm starting to see how this all ties together. It's not just about tweaking policies here and there. It's about transforming the whole system, finance, trade, power structures, so that it actually works for the people who are feeding the world.
That's a great way to put it. And ultimately, it all comes back to this idea of collaboration, Governments, businesses, investors, and most importantly, those small-scale producers themselves, all working together to make this happen.
Speaking of collaboration, you mentioned something earlier about a global expert review on debt, nature, and climate. What's that all about?
This is where it gets really interesting.
Okay, so you were about to spill the tea on this global expert review. What's the big deal?
Well, it's a pretty bold initiative, actually. It was launched at COP28, the big UN climate conference,
Yeah.
and it's being championed by Kenya and Colombia.
What are they hoping to achieve?
It's basically a call for a deep dive, a serious rethinking of how we can restructure global debt to tackle these interconnected crises of climate change, biodiversity loss, and unsustainable development. They're recognizing that the current system just isn't working.
So they're not just talking about tweaking things around the edges. They want to fundamentally change how the global financial system works.
Yeah, they're acknowledging that we can't keep piling debt onto developing countries, especially when a lot of that debt is tied to practices that are actually making the climate crisis worse.
It sounds like a massive undertaking. How would they even begin to do this?
The details are still being worked out, but the idea is to bring together a diverse group of experts, economists, climate scientists, development specialists, and crucially, representatives from communities that are on the front lines of these crises.
So it's not just a bunch of academics sitting in an ivory tower. They're actually bringing in the people who are directly impacted by these issues.
Exactly, and the goal is for them to really dig into the problem and come up with concrete solutions. We're looking at things like debt for nature swaps, but also more innovative ideas like debt for climate swaps, or even a mechanism to cancel debt for countries that are hit by climate disasters.
Debt for climate swaps. That sounds interesting. What's the difference between that and a debt for nature swap?
Well, a debt for nature swap usually focuses on investing in conservation projects, like protecting forests or coral reefs. A debt for climate swap would kind of broaden that scope to include things like investing in renewable energy or climate-resilient infrastructure.
So it's like taking that basic concept and applying it to the whole spectrum of climate action.
Exactly. And the idea of canceling debt for countries hit by climate disasters, that's about recognizing that climate change is already having a devastating impact on many vulnerable countries. And it's simply unfair to expect them to keep paying off debts when they're struggling to cope with the consequences.
It's like saying, hey, we're all in this together and we need to support each other through these tough times. But realistically, do you think these big, powerful countries are actually willing to give up some of their power and change the system in such a fundamental way?
That's the million-dollar question. It will definitely require a major shift in mindset, a recognition that we can't address these global challenges without addressing the underlying inequalities and injustices that are built into the system.
So it's not just about technical solutions, it's about challenging those deep-rooted power structures.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important that this expert review includes diverse voices, including those from the Global South who have been historically marginalized in these discussions.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together, from those local consistency makers to these big global initiatives. And I'm realizing that even my choices as a consumer play a role in this whole system.
You've hit on a crucial point. Every time you buy something, whether it's food or clothing or anything else, you're participating in a web of financial flows that are either supporting or undermining these broader efforts to create a more just and sustainable world.
So it's not just about governments and big institutions, it's about all of us making conscious choices in our everyday lives.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we're all interconnected and that even small actions can have a ripple effect.
Well, I have to say this deep dive has given me a lot to think about. It's a complex and challenging issue, but it's also inspiring to see that there are people out there working on creative solutions and that we can all be part of the change.
That's the spirit. The more we understand these issues, the more empowered we are to make a difference.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this conversation?
I want them to remember that even though these global challenges can feel overwhelming, there's always reason for hope. There are people working on solutions, and every single one of us can contribute to building a more just and sustainable future.
It all starts with awareness, right? Once you see the connections, you can't unsee them.
Exactly. And once you see the potential for change, you can't help but be part of it.
So the next time you're at the grocery store, take a moment to consider where your food came from, who grew it, and what policies and practices made it possible. Are they supporting climate resilience? Are they empowering small-scale farmers? These are the questions we need to be asking ourselves if we want to create a food system that nourishes both people and the planet. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.